Oh my God.
Most people look at old sketches and see nothing but faded pencil marks on yellowed paper. They file them away, donate them to thrift stores, or toss them in the trash without a second thought. But what if one simple drawing, just a few lines on a piece of paper, held the power to change someone's life? What if a sketch that meant nothing to everyone else meant everything to the one person who needed it most? This is a story about how art, forgotten for decades, found its way back into the world at the exact moment when hope was running out. It's about a horse that nobody wanted to save, until one person realized that the answers they were looking for had been sitting in a dusty attic all along. It's about how the smallest things, a charcoal sketch, a pencil stroke, a child's drawing, can become legendary when they reach the right hands at the right time. What you're about to read isn't just a story about an animal, it's about redemption. It's about how truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's been buried. It's about the power of one person refusing to give up, and a forgotten horse becoming a symbol of justice that shook an entire town. The question that haunts everyone who hears this story is simple. How did no one see it coming? Let the story begin. The morning started like every other morning at Ridgewood Farm, except it would be the last one anyone would ever forget. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, still struggling against the thick gray clouds that hung low over the Colorado plains like a curse. It was October, the kind of October that came early and stayed too long cold enough to make breath visible, wet enough to turn the earth into mud, and bleak enough to drain the color out of everything. The stable yard smelled of hay and manure and something else nobody wanted to name. The horse's name was Ember, though that name belonged to better days. She was a quarter horse, once chestnut brown with a white blaze down her face that had made her beautiful. Now her coat was dull, matted in places, and her ribs showed through like the outline of a blueprint drawn on skin. She was 17 years old in a body that looked 30. Her hooves were cracked and overgrown, curling slightly at the edges because nobody had bothered to trim them in months. When she moved, it wasn't a walk, it was a shuffle, the kind of movement an animal makes when every step is a negotiation with pain. The man leading her from the stable was called James Whitmore. He was the ranch foreman at Ridgewood, the kind of man who had worked with horses his entire life and had learned to make a living from their suffering. He wore a weathered Stetson that had seen better days, and his face was the color of an old saddle creased, hardened, and expressionless. His hands were thick and calloused, and when he jerked on Ember's lead rope, she flinched even though the rope went slack. She flinched because it was what she had learned to do. 3 other people were in the stable yard that morning. There was Marcus Webb, who owned Ridgewood and showed up maybe once a week in his expensive truck with its leather interior and radio always playing. There was Katie, a high school student who worked part-time cleaning stalls and mucking pens. She was 17, with dark hair pulled back in a desperate bun and eyes that had already learned to look away. There was also a man neither of the regular employees recognized, a veterinarian named Dr. Larson, who had been called in not to save the horse, but to evaluate whether she was still worth anything. Ember walked 6 steps into the center of the yard. Then her back legs collapsed underneath her. It happened without warning, without dignity, and without mercy. Her body simply gave out, her rear end dropping to the ground while her front legs scrambled uselessly for purchase. She didn't scream or panic. She just stood there on her front legs, her entire back half in the mud, her breathing shallow and labored. Her eyes were still open, dark and aware, looking at nothing in particular, but understanding everything. This is what broken looks like when it stops fighting. Nobody moved. Marcus Webb stood with his hands on his hips, his expensive cashmere sweater pristine and untouched by the mud that was now splattered on Ember's coat. He looked at Dr. Larson with the expression of a man waiting for a verdict he didn't particularly care about. James Whitmore stood holding the lead rope with the same expression he wore while drinking his morning coffee, completely neutral, completely detached. Katie turned away, and when her shoulders moved, it was hard to know if she was crying or just breathing. Dr. Larson stepped closer to the horse, his black medical bag hanging from one hand. He didn't kneel down. He didn't touch her to check for injuries or feel for signs of life still worth saving. He simply looked at the horse collapsed in the mud and then looked back at Marcus Webb. His expression said everything that needed to be said, and they both understood the subtext perfectly. "She's done," the veterinarian said. His voice was quiet, but his words were heavy as stones. "There's nothing left here worth keeping." The morning was so quiet that everyone could hear the wind coming down from the mountains. Nobody came to help Ember to her feet. Nobody brought water or blankets or hope. She remained exactly as she had fallen, breathing dust and mud, waiting for what would come next. The sky continued to press down on the earth like a weight, and somewhere in that terrible silence, a legend was being born, though nobody in the stable yard knew it yet. It would take a forgotten drawing, buried in a dusty attic for 30 years, to make them understand what they were really looking at that morning. It would take a sketch, just a few lines of charcoal on old paper, to reveal the truth about Ember, about her past, and about the crimes that had kept her suffering for so long. But that truth was still locked away, waiting in darkness, unknown to everyone, except for one person who had drawn it when she was just a child, and who had been searching for it her entire life. For now, Ember simply waited in the mud, and the people around her prepared to do what they always did. They prepared to make her suffering disappear.
The truth about Ember wasn't a secret that someone had actively kept. It was worse than that. It was a truth that people had simply chosen not to see, the kind of truth that exists in plain sight, but gets hidden away by convenient forgetting and deliberate ignorance. She had been at Ridgewood Farm for 6 years, and in that time, nearly everyone in the small town of Riverside, Colorado had seen her, walking along fence lines, standing in pastures, being led to work. But they had stopped actually looking at her a long time ago. 6 years before that October morning, Ember had belonged to a woman named Eleanor Hartley. Eleanor was 92 years old then, a widow with no children and a small pension that barely covered food and rent. But she had Ember, her only companion, her only joy, the only being in the world that still needed her and loved her without condition. Eleanor would spend hours in Ember's stall, combing her mane, braiding her tail, talking to the horse about her life and her memories and her regrets. Ember was everything to her. When Eleanor died, quietly, in her sleep, the way people hope to die, there was no one to fight for her horse. There was paperwork, and there was probate, and there were debts. A lawyer looked at Eleanor's will and found that the horse had been left to her niece, Sarah, who was 25 years old and working in Denver as a graphic designer. The lawyer called Sarah and told her the news, and Sarah, overwhelmed with grief and with the complications of managing an estate from 4 hours away, made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She sold Ember to James Whitmore and Ridgewood Farm. The price was $3,000, which seemed reasonable at the time. Whitmore assured her that Ember would be well cared for, that she would have a good home, that she would help with the farm's breeding program and trail riding. Sarah had believed him because she had needed to believe him. She had needed to walk away from her grief and return to her job and pretend that the best thing to do for her aunt's beloved horse was to send her away to people who promised to care for her. Over the next 6 years, Sarah would attempt to visit Ember twice. Both times, Whitmore told her that the horse wasn't available, that she was out in the back pastures, that Sarah should call next time to arrange a proper viewing. The second time Sarah tried to visit, Marcus Webb had met her at the gate and told her that Ridgewood Farm was private property and that visitors needed written permission. Sarah had driven away that day with a sick feeling in her stomach, but she had pushed it down, buried it under work and relationships and the daily tasks that allow us to ignore our guilt. But it never went away. It had only grown stronger. For 6 years, Sarah had driven past Ridgewood whenever she visited her mother in Riverside. For 6 years, she had told herself that Ember was probably fine, that she was probably being used for trail rides, that she was probably living a good life. But her hands had trembled every time she drove past the property, and she had never once turned in to actually see. The truth was that Sarah had stopped believing her own lies somewhere around year 3, but she was too afraid of what she would find to investigate further. Then, 3 weeks before Ember's collapse in the stable yard, Sarah had been clearing out her late mother's house. Her mother had passed away 2 months earlier, leaving Sarah as the only living relative connected to Ridgewood and Eleanor and all the pieces of her childhood. She had climbed into the attic looking for old photo albums, and instead she had found a box of drawings. The drawings were in an old portfolio case, yellowed and brittle with age. They had been made by a child, done in charcoal and pencil, simple but unmistakably talented. One showed a farm with mountains in the background. One showed a woman in profile, her face kind and worn. And one showed a horse that was impossible to mistake. Even though the drawing was done in simple lines, even though the artist was clearly just a child of maybe 8 or 9 years old, the horse in the drawing had Ember's distinctive white blaze. The horse in the drawing was being held by the same woman in profile, and both of them were smiling. On the back of the drawing, in a child's careful handwriting, were 3 words, Grandma and Ember. Sarah had felt the world shift beneath her feet. The drawing was dated 43 years ago. Eleanor had owned Ember for 43 years. That meant Ember was at least 60 years old, possibly older. That meant everything Whitmore had told her was a lie. That meant a horse that was already ancient had been worked, probably hard, for the entire time she had been at Ridgewood. That night, Sarah had called the farm. When James Whitmore answered, she had asked to see Ember. His response had been immediate and cold. The horse is fine. There's nothing to see. But there was everything to see. There was the truth that Sarah had been running from for 6 years, and it was finally terribly clear. She had driven to Riverside the next morning. She had called the veterinarian and the county animal control. She had left messages and made reports and told anyone who would listen that there was a horse at Ridgewood Farm that needed immediate help. She had done everything except what she should have done 6 years ago. She had fought. Ember's collapse in the stable yard 3 weeks later wasn't an accident. It was inevitable. It was the consequence of years of neglect and suffering finally reaching its breaking point. But Sarah was finally ready to see it. The question was whether anyone else would believe her, and whether it would matter now that it was almost too late. Dr. Larson was writing in his notebook the kind of notation that sounds clinical and simple, but actually means death warrant. Marcus Webb was already on his phone, calling the rendering company to schedule a pickup. In his mind, the decision had already been made. Ember would be euthanized that afternoon. Her body would be removed by evening. And by tomorrow morning, Ridgewood Farm would continue operating as if she had never existed. This was the way these things worked. This was the way they always worked. But something interrupted this carefully practiced routine. A vehicle pulled into the stable yard. A blue sedan that nobody recognized, moving fast enough that gravel kicked up behind the tires. The car stopped at an angle, and a woman in her early 30s got out without bothering to turn off the engine. She was wearing jeans and a jacket, and her face was pale with something that looked like rage or terror or both simultaneously. It was Sarah. She had driven north from Denver in 3.5 hours, breaking speed limits the entire way. She had received an anonymous call 20 minutes ago from someone at the veterinary clinic, Katie, the high school student who cleaned stalls, who had found Sarah's contact information on paperwork filed in the office. Katie had whispered in her phone that they were about to put down a horse, that Sarah should come now if she was going to come at all. "Stop," Sarah called out, walking toward the group gathered around Ember's collapsed form. Her voice was shaking, but it was audible. It cut through the morning air like something sharp. "You cannot euthanize this horse." Marcus Webb turned to look at her with the expression of someone dealing with a minor inconvenience. "And who the hell are you?" "I'm Sarah Hartley. My family owned this horse before you did. And I have documentation, witnesses, and historical evidence that you've been committing animal abuse for 6 years." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Whitmore's face went dark. Webb's expression didn't change. He was too experienced with problems to show immediate concern. But Dr. Larson looked up from his notebook, and there was something in his eyes that had shifted. He had been in this situation before, and he knew what came next. "You need to leave this property," Webb said, his voice low and controlled. "This is private land, and you're trespassing." Sarah pulled out her phone. She had already recorded video when she arrived, footage of Ember collapsed, footage of the veterinarian's indifference, footage of the rendering company's phone number visible on the papers in Webb's hand. But more than that, she had her evidence. She had Eleanor's medical records showing that Eleanor had owned the horse until 1980. She had photographs from Eleanor's files. She had adoption papers, veterinary records from 40 years ago, proof of ownership stretching back further than anything Ridgewood Farm could produce. But what she pulled out first was the drawing. The charcoal sketch of the horse and the woman, dated 43 years ago, the words Grandma and Ember, written in a child's careful hand. She held it up so everyone in the yard could see it. The image was simple, but it was undeniable. It was the proof that Ember had belonged to Eleanor for longer than anyone at Ridgewood Farm had been alive. "This horse's name is Ember," Sarah said, her voice steadier now. "She belonged to my great-grandmother Eleanor Hartley for 43 years. When Eleanor died, she was left in my care, and I made a terrible mistake by trusting you to take care of her. I should have fought harder then, but I'm fighting now." Katie emerged from the barn, where she had been waiting. She held a folder in her hands, records that she had carefully photographed and compiled over the past 6 years. Maintenance logs that showed Ember had been used for heavy work while her health declined. Veterinary bills for treatments that had never been properly administered. Feed logs that documented deliberate underfeeding. Every piece of evidence that a young girl with a conscience had gathered, waiting for someone to care enough to use it. Within that folder was also something else. A letter from Eleanor Hartley, dated 1980, the year she died. In the letter, Eleanor had expressed her wishes for Ember. She had hoped that the horse would be allowed to retire, to live out her remaining years in peace and comfort. She had hoped that she would never be forced to work or suffer. Eleanor had understood, even then, that Ember was ancient and fragile and deserving of rest. The rendering company wouldn't arrive that day. Dr. Larson would change his assessment. Whitmore and Webb would eventually both be charged with animal cruelty and negligence. The case would make local news and then regional news. But the most powerful part of the story, the part that would become legendary, was not what came next legally or judicially. It was that Ember survived. Despite being 63 years old, despite years of malnutrition and overwork, despite the weakness that had dropped her in the mud that morning, Ember survived. She was transported to an equine rehabilitation center in southern Colorado, where a team of specialists worked to restore her health. She received proper nutrition, proper veterinary care, proper rest. Slowly, over months, some of her former strength began to return. But what nobody expected was how the public responded to the story. The drawing, that simple sketch done by a child, became the symbol of everything. It represented innocence. It represented love. It represented a truth that had been buried for so long that when it finally surfaced, people couldn't turn away from it. News outlets ran stories not just about the case, but about Sarah's journey and her redemption. They covered the sketch being displayed in Eleanor's hometown. They covered the outpouring of support from horse rescues across the country. They covered Ember's recovery in heartwarming video after heartwarming video. And they covered what nobody saw coming. The moment when Ember finally stood on all 4 legs again, strong enough to walk on her own, and Sarah led her out to a pasture at the rehabilitation center, where she would spend her remaining years in the peace that Eleanor had wanted for her. In that moment, everything changed. Not just for Ember, but for everyone who understood that sometimes the smallest things, a drawing, a memory, a child's love, have the power to challenge the greatest injustices. The Chimney sketch that everyone thought meant nothing had become everything. And Ember, the horse nobody thought was worth saving, had become legendary. The arrest of James Whitmore and Marcus Webb didn't happen immediately. These things never do. There were lawyers and court dates and procedural delays. But what happened in the court of public opinion was immediate and irreversible. Someone had leaked Sarah's account to a local newspaper reporter named Jennifer Owens, who had spent 20 years investigating stories that made people uncomfortable. Owens saw the sketch, heard the story, and recognized something that her editor would later call the kind of truth that changes things. The first article ran on a Saturday morning with the headline, 43 years of love, buried under 6 years of cruelty. It included the image of the drawing, clear and simple and heartbreaking. It told Eleanor's story, how she had loved a horse for her entire adult life, and how that horse had been systematically abused after Eleanor's death. But most importantly, it told Sarah's story, the guilt, the fear, the final decision to fight. It told Katie's story, the teenager who had been witnessing abuse daily and had found the courage to speak out. By Monday morning, the story had been picked up by national animal welfare organizations. By Wednesday, a documentary filmmaker named Marcus Chun had called Sarah and asked if she would be willing to tell Ember's complete story. By Friday, more than 100 volunteers had arrived in Riverside, Colorado to support the investigation and to attend the preliminary hearing. But the sketch, the drawing, became something unexpected. Someone at the newspaper had decided to display it prominently in the article, not as evidence, but as art. They had printed it in color, enlarged and clear, so that you could see every pencil stroke, every shadow, every deliberate line that a child had made when she was only 8 years old. Eleanor, with her kind face and gentle hands, holding a horse that looked back at the viewer with trust and love. Forensic psychologists who examined the drawing noted that it showed Eleanor's deep emotional connection to the horse. Artists noted the skill and sensitivity of a young girl who clearly had inherited her great-grandmother's talent for capturing emotion on paper. Horse specialists noted the health and condition of the animal in the drawing. There was no evidence of mistreatment, no suggestion of anything except care and companionship. Compared to photographs of Ember taken at Ridgewood Farm just months before her collapse, the contrast was devastating. This was what Eleanor's love looked like. This was what cruelty looked like. The drawing became a visual testament to what had been lost. Sarah gave interviews in which she explained how she had found the drawing, how it had forced her to confront the truth she had been avoiding, how it had finally given her the courage to fight. She talked about her guilt, about the 6 years she had spent in denial, about the moment she realized that love wasn't something Eleanor had stopped expressing. It had been transferred to Sarah as a responsibility to protect what Eleanor had cherished. The sketch was featured in magazines. It was displayed at animal welfare conferences. Artists created tributes based on it. One street artist in Denver created a massive mural showing Eleanor and Ember, with the date of Eleanor's death and the date of Ember's rescue side by side. The image went viral on social media. People from across the world began following the case, began learning about Ember, began understanding that animal abuse was not a distant problem, but something that happened in their communities, in places they drove past every day. The evidence that Katie had compiled turned out to be legally admissible and damaging. Maintenance records proved that Ember had been worked far beyond what an ancient horse should endure. Veterinary records, or rather, the lack of them, proved that her deteriorating health had been ignored. Photographs taken by Katie showed the progression of Ember's decline over 6 years, month by month, a visual documentation of suffering that made jury members openly weep when it was presented in court. Sarah's documentation of ownership was airtight. Eleanor's will, properly filed and legally valid, clearly left Ember to Sarah. Sarah's sale to Whitmore had been made under false pretenses. Whitmore had represented that the horse would be properly cared for, and Sarah had evidence of his emails expressing those exact promises. When the discovery process revealed communication between Whitmore and Webb discussing using Ember for heavy trail work despite her age, prosecutors knew they had them. But the most damaging evidence was something nobody expected. During the investigation, a man named Robert Hartley, who was Sarah's distant cousin and Eleanor's grandnephew, came forward with additional information. Robert had worked at Ridgewood Farm for a brief period in 2019, and he had witnessed Whitmore deliberately pushing Ember beyond her limits on trail rides, sometimes not bringing her back until late evening after 12 or more hours of work. He had also witnessed Whitmore talking to Webb about how much longer Ember could be used before she became completely unusable. Robert had quit on his second day, disturbed by what he saw, but he had never come forward because he was afraid. When Robert testified, his voice cracking as he described watching Ember struggle up steep trails while Whitmore kicked her flanks with his spurs, the entire courtroom went silent. A documentary cameraman captured the moment that Sarah's face crumpled, and when that footage was later shown on news outlets and social media, something shifted in the culture. This wasn't abstract. This wasn't theoretical. This was real cruelty perpetrated by real people, and it had been happening in plain sight while everyone looked away. The sentence handed down was 2 years in prison for each man and a permanent prohibition on owning animals. It wasn't as long as animal welfare advocates wanted. It was far longer than Whitmore's lawyer had hoped for. But what mattered more was that it set a precedent in Colorado. The case established that neglect of an elderly animal, when combined with deliberate overwork and systematic denial of care, constituted felony animal abuse. Other cases that had previously been dismissed began to be reinvestigated under this new precedent. But for Sarah, the legal victory was secondary to something more important. In the months following the arrest and trial, she received hundreds of letters from people who had seen the drawing, read the story, and been inspired to finally address animal abuse in their own communities. A woman in Texas wrote about using the case to convince authorities to investigate a neglected horse sanctuary. A teenager in New York wrote about starting an animal welfare club at her school. A veterinarian in Arizona wrote about finally reporting a colleague whom she had suspected of abuse for years. The drawing, Eleanor's simple charcoal sketch, had become a symbol of how one person's love, preserved for decades in paper and pencil, could outlast cruelty. It proved that what we create in love persists, that what we document with our own hands carries power that photographs and videos sometimes cannot match. It proved that a truth hidden for 43 years could still change everything when it finally emerged. Ember never knew any of this. She never knew about the courtroom or the media or the precedent being set. She only knew that the pain began to fade, that her ribs stopped showing, that her breathing became easier. She only knew that there was a woman named Sarah who visited her regularly at the rehabilitation center, who sometimes brought Eleanor's other sketches and drawings, who sat with her in the pasture and told her stories about Eleanor, about the woman who had loved her for 43 years and whose love had somehow, impossibly, reached across time and death and neglect to save her. 3 years after the morning she collapsed in the stable yard at Ridgewood Farm, Ember stood in a pasture in southern Colorado, and nothing about her suggested that she was 66 years old. She would never be the horse she was when Eleanor first drew her. That was a kind of youth and vitality that cannot be reclaimed once it has been lost. But she had regained something more important than physical perfection. She had regained the ability to be peaceful. Her coat was glossy now, the brown deepened by proper nutrition and care. Her ribs were no longer visible. Her hooves had been properly trimmed and were growing and healthy. She could walk for hours without exhaustion, and she could trot. And on good days, she could even canter, not with the fire of a young horse, but with the quiet confidence of an animal that had learned it would not be punished for its strength. Sarah visited 3 times a week, sometimes bringing visitors from across the country who had traveled specifically to see the horse that had become legendary. Nobody called her by Whitmore's preferred name anymore. She was Ember again, not because the name had been restored to her, but because the world had decided it was the only name that fit. Ember, like embers that seemed to be dying but contained heat that could be rekindled if given the right conditions. Ember, like something that had burned down but could glow again. The drawing had been displayed at the Denver Art Museum in a special exhibition dedicated to Eleanor Hartley, who had been largely unknown during her lifetime, but whose artistic vision and emotional sensitivity had been discovered only after her death. The exhibition was called Love Preserved, and it included not just Eleanor's sketches of horses and landscapes, but also her personal journals, her letters, and even photographs of her daily life. People came from across the country to see the work of a woman who had lived quietly in Colorado and had loved with such depth that it had transcended decades. But the most visited item in the exhibition was not one of Eleanor's paintings. It was a photograph. The photograph showed Sarah standing in a pasture with Ember, and Sarah was holding the original drawing, the one that had started everything. Eleanor and Ember were drawn on the paper, and in the photograph, the living Ember stood beside Sarah's shoulder, looking at the image of herself as she had been, looking at the woman who had drawn her with love, looking at something that connected past and present and future. The photographer who captured that image won a national award. When she accepted it, she gave her entire prize money to the animal sanctuary where Ember now lived. She talked about how that single moment, that intersection of past love and present redemption, had changed the way she understood her work. She talked about how sometimes the most powerful images were not about capturing something new, but about revealing something that had been true all along, something that had been waiting to be seen. Ember had become the logo of an international animal welfare organization. Her image appeared on fundraising materials, on educational websites, on the covers of books about animal cruelty and recovery. Children who had never been to Colorado knew her story. Schools used her case as the basis for lessons about speaking up and standing against injustice. A young girl in Argentina had written an essay about Ember for a school assignment, and that essay had won a national competition. A boy in South Africa had started an animal rescue program inspired by Ember's story, and that program had saved dozens of horses from similar situations. But perhaps the most significant impact came from something quieter. In the 3 years since her rescue, more than 200 horses had been removed from abusive situations because investigators, armed with new legal precedents from Ember's case, had finally pursued cases that had previously been overlooked. In Colorado alone, animal welfare laws had been strengthened. Other states had begun to examine their own statutes. Prosecutors who had previously treated animal abuse as a minor offense began treating it as the serious crime it was. Sarah had left her job as a graphic designer and was now working full-time as an animal welfare advocate. She traveled to schools and communities, showing the drawing to young people and asking them a simple question: what would you do if you saw something wrong but were afraid to speak up? She talked about her own guilt, her own delay, her own complicity through inaction. She talked about how fear and shame had almost prevented her from doing what should have been obvious. Eleanor's work, all of it, not just the drawing, had been published in book form. The proceeds were donated to equine rescue and retirement facilities. Universities began offering courses that examined Eleanor's artistic legacy and her emotional intelligence as expressed through her work. A documentary about Eleanor, Sarah, and Ember premiered at a major film festival and received multiple award nominations. In the documentary, there was one scene that affected viewers so deeply that it appeared in nearly every review. It was Sarah sitting in the pasture with Eleanor's drawing in one hand, reading Eleanor's journals aloud while Ember stood beside her listening. Sarah read Eleanor's words about the day she bought Ember as a young mare, about the decades they had spent together, about Eleanor's hope that after her death, Ember would be cared for with the same love that she herself had provided. And then Sarah read Eleanor's final journal entry, written just 3 days before Eleanor died, when she was already too weak to leave her bed. Ember will outlive me. Eleanor had written, I know this, and I wonder if anyone will love her the way I have loved her. I wonder if anyone will understand that she is not just a horse, but a creature worthy of devotion, worthy of gentleness, worthy of everything I've tried to give her. If no one else comes, then perhaps no one will. And that will be my greatest sorrow. But I have drawn her so many times, in so many ways, that perhaps something of my love is captured there. Perhaps if anyone ever finds those drawings, they will understand. They will understand that this animal mattered to me. They will understand that she was loved. When Sarah finished reading those words, she set the journal down and looked at Ember, and the documentary captured both of them. The horse who had survived cruelty that should have destroyed her, and the woman who had carried guilt across 6 years until she found the courage to act. It captured a moment of connection that went beyond words, beyond explanation, beyond anything that could be articulated in language. Ember never ran again after she came to the sanctuary, but she also never showed fear. People could approach her, could touch her, could lead her, and she responded with a calmness that suggested she had finally understood that humans could be trusted again. She made friends with the other rescue horses at the sanctuary, and she became something like their elder, their guide. Young horses that arrived traumatized or angry or broken seemed to calm when they were near Ember. Staff members at the sanctuary said that she had an almost therapeutic effect, that her presence was healing in ways they could not fully explain. The drawing itself became an artifact, preserved under climate-controlled glass in a museum. But copies of it were displayed everywhere, in veterinary clinics, in schools, in police departments, in animal welfare offices. It became the image that represented what cruelty takes and what love leaves behind. It represented Eleanor's hope reaching across decades. It represented Sarah's redemption. It represented Ember's survival. Years later, when people would ask Sarah about the moment she found the drawing, she would tell them that it wasn't luck. It was Eleanor still protecting Ember, still loving her, still finding a way to ensure that her beloved horse would be saved. And when people asked Ember's story at sanctuaries and rescue organizations, they would begin with the drawing, with the image of a child's hand creating something beautiful and true, something that would wait patient and quiet in an attic for 43 years until the exact moment when it was needed most. The Chimney sketch that everyone thought meant nothing had become everything. And Ember, the forgotten horse that nobody thought was worth saving, had become a legend that would endure long after everyone involved in her rescue was gone. She had become proof that love is stronger than cruelty, that truth persists even when buried, and that sometimes, when we finally have the courage to look at what we have been ignoring, we find the power to change everything. In the end, there was no dramatic rescue, no moment of violence or justice that felt complete. There was only an old horse, finally at peace, finally safe, finally home. And a drawing. Two simple figures rendered in charcoal and hope, proving that Eleanor's love had never left, that it had only been waiting for Sarah to see it, waiting for the world to understand that the smallest things, created with the deepest love, contain the power to transform everything that comes after.